Hello and welcome dear students to the course of MS 495, that is Green Supply Chain Management, and being offered by the Department of Management Sciences here at GIKI Institute during the semester Spring 2020. Alright, I'll just move slowly towards the pre-made content that has already been covered up. That was Introduction, Sustainability and Emissions, Global and Local Relationship, Closed loop supply chains, that was more relevant towards recycling. Similarly, we had studied renewable materials management, sustainable purchasing, green inventory management, and green logistics. So this all content is something that has been covered in your pre-mid course. Alright, apart from that, during the last few weeks for our online courses, we had covered life cycle assessment for week 1 and week 2. Similarly, you have also been given an assignment that is due in the next week. So far, we have covered up to 9 topics. So for today, we'll be getting on to a new topic, that is carbon footprinting. So exactly the pattern is same. I'll have 2 non-interactive lectures with you and 1 interactive lecture with you during the week, for which the time has already been communicated. So go through these lectures, come prepared for the interactive session, ask me your queries, and I'll try to ask you questions through the methods that have been used previously to make sure that how well you understand things. This topic also comes up with an assignment that is an integral part of this topic. So once you complete the assignment, I'm hopeful that you'll be able to get most out of this topic as well. Before moving ahead, let me tell you exactly what are the learning outcomes from this topic. The first one is exactly what carbon footprinting is. Similarly, at the conclusion of this topic, the student should be able to know why carbon footprinting is important. How can we measure the carbon footprint? What are the various scopes and emissions along the value chain for an organization? And what are the greenhouse gas protocols? So these are some of the things that hopefully by end of this topic, the students should be able to have an understanding of all these relevant questions. And finally, how to measure carbon footprint, particularly for the assignment that you will go through. So the first most important part comes is that what exactly is carbon footprinting and why it is important to calculate the carbon footprint. So let's get on to some definitions. Carbon is often used as a shorthand for greenhouse gases, as carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas released by the human activities. As a consequence, the activity of measuring the greenhouse gas emissions is often referred to as carbon footprinting. So basically, you're not only measuring the carbon content or the carbon dioxide content, rather you are trying to measure all the greenhouse gases that are being emitted through various activities. Similarly, a carbon footprint may concern an organization, a value chain, or a product. So carbon footprinting can be at different stages. It can be for a product, it can be for an entire value chain, or it can be for an organization, exactly how much the organization is emitting in terms of greenhouse gases. The next bit is the organizational carbon footprint accounts for emissions from all activities across an organization, including building energy, industrial process, and the company's vehicles. So these are some of the key points that once we are measuring the carbon footprint for an organization, we may be including the building energy usage, the industrial processes that are going within an organization, and finally the overall transportation or the distribution network that is owned by the organization. The next bit is obviously value chain. In value chain, carbon footprint includes emissions outside the organization's own operations. So it includes your internal and external, rather more concerned about your external stakeholders. Exactly. So you measure the emissions from the suppliers and the consumers, including product use and end of life cycle emissions. So basically this is the bit where exactly you are more focused towards your external stakeholders, that are your suppliers, that may be your third-party logistic providers, that can be your consumers, that can be the recycling or the disposal companies, and obviously your consumer. And during the usage of the product, a few products might emit certain amount of CO2 or any other greenhouse gas emissions. So that all is something that you're concerned while measuring the value chain carbon footprint. The next bit is the product carbon footprint includes emissions over the whole life cycle of a given unit of product or service, from the extraction of raw materials and manufacturing to its use and final reuse, recycling and disposal. So this is more towards the life cycle assessment bit that you have already carried out. So you measure the exact carbon footprint of the entire product, that starts from raw material acquisition to the manufacturing, usage and finally disposal or end of life of the product. So that was basically life cycle assessment that has already been done. So within this part we will not be focusing towards the life cycle assessment. We'll be more concerned about the first two bits, that is the organizational carbon footprint and the value chain carbon footprint. So getting on to our next question, that is why exactly carbon footprinting is important. The first bit is because you need to measure your company's corporate social responsibilities. You have multiple matrices and you need to really make sure that you cross the key performance indicators better than the market average or better than what the competitors are telling. Similarly, using carbon footprinting, we can identify various hotspots in terms of the entire value chain, that exactly which are the bits that really need to be improvised over the period of time. Similarly, it is used for government and investors, because the governments give you certain level of benefits once you are basically having less amount of greenhouse gas emissions. You might have some tax incentives as well, and similarly for investors as well, because there are group of investors now who are more environmental concerned and they really want to invest in some company that is more concerned about the sustainability and the environmental aspect. So that's the reason you need to put this into your company corporate reports. Similarly, for your supplier selection, obviously if you are a company that is saying that you are a greener company, you really need to make sure that your suppliers are green as well, because this is not a one-way process, rather it needs to be for everyone. So really, using the carbon footprint calculations provided by your suppliers or potential suppliers, you can really assess them to which one is the better in terms of sustainability or being more environmental friendly. Similarly, for supply chain design, obviously you have your value chain and you really need to design your supply chain, so you really need to be concerned about the points where you need to put up the most efforts, where you need to reduce your efforts for the environmental sustainability. And finally, if you're branding your company as an eco-efficient company or a green company, so that is the reason you really need to put up these values of carbon footprinting into the public, so that everyone is aware and you are really in line with the objectives or the brand image that you are setting for your consumers. Okay, exactly. This video is telling about what really is carbon footprint. So let's have a look into this video, and this should give you much more realistic idea to exactly what carbon footprint is.
Show explains the carbon footprint. This is you. You've probably been hearing a lot about climate change and how you should reduce your carbon footprint. But what is that exactly? Just like an actual footprint, it's a mark you leave upon the environment. No, not with your shoes, but with every action that releases carbons. Those are the harmful gases, such as CO2, which are pumped out by burning fossil fuels like oil or gas. The more fuel you use, the bigger your footprint will be. You may think that by driving your car, the only carbons you release come from the engine, but no. Consider the carbons that are emitted just to get fuel into the tank, from the energy needed to extract the oil from underground, the pollution caused by transportation and refinement, to the final delivery to your local petrol station. Not to mention the CO2 released by manufacturing your car in the first place. More than you thought, huh? So unless you live in a cave, you and everything you own has its own carbon footprint. Read a book? Printing and distributing. It uses energy. Brush your teeth, and your utensils will have a history in a factory. Even something as basic as an apple could have traveled hundreds or even thousands of polluting miles to end up in your local supermarket. You see, it's pretty much impossible to leave no carbon footprint behind, but that's no reason to stop trying. Think about your actions and choices, and you'll be able to reduce your personal mark after all. That's how you really put the boot into climate change.
Alright, so that was more of a simplistic version to really make you understand what a carbon footprint is, more concerned about the literal meaning from the word. Alright, so the next bit is exactly what are the greenhouse gases and overall what is their effect or the impact on the environment in the long run. So the first one is methane. Methane has an atmospheric lifetime of 12.4 years. Similarly, on a 100 years global warming potential, it scores 28. Similarly, for 20 years, methane has a global warming potential of 84. So that means in the first initial 20 years, methane is more reactive or more damaging towards the environment as compared to the 100 years. Similarly, we have hydrofluorocarbons that has an atmospheric lifetime of 13.4 years. And over 100 years, the global warming potential, the potential warmth or the potential amount of energy this can absorb and release over a period of 100 years is somewhere around 1300. And similarly, within the first 20 years, it is more environmental damaging. Similarly, we have carbon fluorocarbons. Similarly, we have nitrous compounds, we have carbon dioxide as well, and we have CF, that is tetrafluoromethane. So all these are the gases that are included within the greenhouse gases, and their overall impact on the environment is something that is listed within the table. So this is just to give you a realistic idea to which of the gases are damaging and to what extent do they really damage the environment in a period of 20 years and a period of 100 years. So exactly the next part comes that how do you measure the carbon footprint? There are 4 key methodologies for measuring the carbon footprint. The first one is your direct measurement. The second one is energy-based calculations. Then we have activity-based calculations. And finally, we have economic input-output life cycle assessment. So for now, we'll be more concerned for your assignment bit towards the energy and the activity-based calculations. And I'll exactly tell you in the upcoming lecture that how you need to perform your calculations to make sure that you calculate whatever that is right. So people, getting on to the first bit, that is your direct measurement. That is through sensors and other tools or lab experiments. So supposedly I really want to measure the carbon dioxide content or the greenhouse gases emitted by a particular. Okay, so moving on to the next one. Concerned to your assignment, that is basically using the conversion factors. Supposedly you have a transportation being provided by a third-party logistics provider and they don't really want to share the data with you. So what you have, you know the distance traveled, you know the weights moved, and obviously you use the truck efficiency for similar trucks to really measure that how much amount of diesel has been consumed to move this much amount of weight. You multiply that with conversion factors, and through this mode of extrapolation, you are able to find results relevant to your CO2 emissions. I have not touched this or given a more detailed example right now because this is something that we'll be discussing later on in the topic. The next part is economic input-output lifecycle assessment, which enables converting the expenditures of a company in a given industry sector into an average amount of carbon emissions. So, for example, we have an X dollar spending on transportation industry, which leads to an average of Y tons of CO2 emissions. So that is more towards your financial bit. That this much amount of spending is basically contributing to this much tons of CO2. So this is more towards your supply chain accounting, and also this bit is something that we'll not be discussing in the later on calculations, or not relevant to your assignment. So people, getting on to the next important bit, that is your greenhouse gases protocol. Exactly, before that I move into the greenhouse gas protocols, I really want you to recall the scopes of emissions that you had studied previously. So we have the first scope, that is scope 1 of emissions. That was the direct carbon emissions. And what were the sources? That the sources, they come from the sources owned or controlled by the company. Example, boilers, furnaces, and the vehicles owned by the company. So basically all those relevant stakes where the company has a direct control, or the company owns them and takes the responsibility, and also has the ability to change their efficiencies, to change their input and outputs. So this is something that is counted towards your direct emissions or your scope 1 emissions. Moving towards scope 2 emissions, which are indirect carbon emissions and mostly concerned about purchased energy. So what it really includes is basically the acquired electricity, the steam, the heat, and the cooling used by any sort of company. So supposedly I'm an organization, I want to report my carbon footprint. I'll be going to measure my indirect emissions that are possibly not being at my site, not being produced at my site, but being produced at an off-site. But obviously I need to add them up for calculating my carbon footprint. So basically this is more concerned about how much energy or electricity is being consumed in an organization, or how much electricity units or electricity in gigawatt hour or megawatt hour is being consumed at my site, or by the processes that are being performed at the site to make a particular product. Similarly, we have scope 3 emissions, that are all other indirect carbon emissions. Example, we have material suppliers, we have third party logistic providers, we have waste management suppliers, travel suppliers, lessees and lessors, franchisees, retailers, employees, and customers. So all the indirect emissions are all the more upstream and the downstream emissions that are not really concerned with you, but are mostly associated with the organizations or the people working with their organizations. So this is something that we measure in scope 3 of the emissions, that is all other indirect emissions. So scope 3 emissions are all the indirect emissions, including both upstream purchased products or purchased product transportation, and downstream, example, use of sold products or disposal of sold products. So all these things are included in your carbon footprint. So this is more of the same thing, that if you're going for a life cycle assessment, what you do, you put things in various stages, like raw material acquisition, like manufacturing, disposal, end of life cycle, or recycling as well. So within carbon footprinting, what you really need to consider is all the 3 scopes of emissions for the carbon footprint. So add them up and basically what you get. So supposedly for manufacturing, I'll be looking into concern about more towards scope 1 and scope 2 emissions as well. And if I'm going for a more detailed study that says that, all right, I really want to know that how much a uranium enrichment plant is basically, or how much a hydrogen fuel cell contributes to the carbon or the greenhouse gases. So what I'll do is simply I'll look into the scope 1 and the scope 2 emissions, that is electricity and the direct emissions that are being produced at the site. But obviously I really need to look into that, how much energy was consumed by my suppliers while extracting uranium, while transporting that at my site, and finally if I really want to dispose that of. So alright, so exactly to what we discussed in the previous bit was scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 of emissions. How do they come from the upstream and the downstream? This is more of a summary to exactly what we are concerned about. So in terms of my upstream, I'm more concerned about the electricity that is being used by my suppliers. Similarly, I'm also referring to the scope 3 emissions, that is basically the emissions being produced at the supplier's site. And similarly, I'm also reporting my scope 1 of emissions, that is at my facility or the organization's location. Similarly, for the downstream, I'm more concerned about the scope 3 emissions that are more relevant towards the distribution, towards the logistics, towards the warehousing bit, to exactly how much amount of energy was used or how much amount of electricity is being consumed at each and every bit, and how much it is relating to the amount of emissions of greenhouse gases. So this is just to give you a summary to exactly how a value chain works. That includes your upstream activities, your reporting company, and your downstream activities, and how the scopes and the sources of emission vary across your value chain. So coming on to the next bit, that by end of this topic or this lecture part, let me summarize to exactly what we have gone through. The first bit is that carbon footprinting is a technique to measure greenhouse gas emissions from either a product, value chain, or organization. Similarly, we have studied that carbon footprinting is an important piece of information shared with internal and external stakeholders. Similarly, we come to know that there are 4 key methods to calculate the carbon footprint, and amongst those 4, we'll be focusing more towards the 2 key methods that are being used for or more relevant to your coursework. So people, I do hope that at the end of this topic you are able to have a clarity exactly to about what is carbon footprinting. You should be knowing by now that why carbon footprinting is important. Similarly, what are the techniques used to measure the carbon footprint, and finally, what are the various scopes and emissions along the value chain for an organization. So for this lecture, we have discussed all the basic aspects of carbon footprinting and how they are measured. More details are in your upcoming lectures that will be uploaded soon. Study this lecture, make sure that you go through each and every bit, get into the details of this, come prepared for the upcoming session that is due by tomorrow. So make sure that you have a lot much queries relevant to whatever you are studying, because at the end of this topic as well, you'll be getting an individual assignment, and the weightage and all the details will be given to you in the interactive class. So hopefully you are learning and you are trying to follow the instructions that are being communicated through this mode. Try to make sure that you get the most out of this online learning. In case you have any sort of individual queries as well, you can simply get back to me. That is not an issue. So thanks a lot for listening. Hopefully see you in the next session.